Are women taking over the world? It's an interesting question, isn't it? I'm not going to spoil you by telling the answer, which of course I know. This year we saw the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day around the world. International Women's Day was held officially 100 years ago, obviously, with meetings and street demonstrations held across Europe, campaigning for pay equality and the right to vote for women. This was the time of the suffragettes, when ladies like Emmeline Pankhurst were being arrested, were going on hunger strike, were dying for their belief that women had equal rights. The centenary of International Women's Day this year is an occasion to review how far we've come in our struggle for equality and peace for women. I see that there's been a recent series here at the Wheeler Centre which is around Has Feminism Failed? If you look back over the last 100 years, it's hard to argue that it has failed. Feminism has become a bit of a dirty word, and really it's only about equal rights. It's hard to actually argue once you delve into what feminism really is, that it's something that's wrong. I love reading about great women in the past, and I was doing some research for this talk looking at women who are ruling the world, great rulers. I'm from the UK originally, so I was drawn to some of the historical English women that we've had. Queen Boadicea in AD 60, who gave the Romans a good hiding. Elizabeth I, one of the greatest queens of England. Dare I mention her, Margaret Thatcher, the UK's first female Prime Minister, elected in 1979. There are many other examples of women stepping up to take their place in history. In 1960, Sirimavo Bandaranaike of Ceylon was elected the world's first female Prime Minister. In 1988, Benazir Bhutto became Prime Minister of Pakistan and the first woman in modern history to lead a Muslim country. Over the last 30 years, there have been around 50 female prime ministers from surprisingly diverse nations. Thanks to Julia Gillard, who's number 48, women prime ministers have now come from every continent except for North America. In many instances, these female prime ministers have been extremely high profile, memorable and successful, with an impact beyond their time in office. Margaret Thatcher in Britain defined a generation. Whether you liked her or not, she still defines a generation for people like myself. Indira Gandhi in India and Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan were defining characters for their countries and the world. In contrast, many of the male prime ministers quietly enter the history books and quickly fade from our memories. But there are so many more of them. To the present day, 52 men and 1 woman have passed through the doors of number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. Since Federation in Australia, there have been 26 male Prime Ministers and 1 woman leading our government. I'm always inspired by Mary Wollstonecraft, who, for those that don't know of her, in the 18th century argued very loudly. She wrote books and manuscripts that women were not naturally inferior to men, that they appeared to be only because they weren't educated. She suggested that both men and women should be treated as rational beings, and she imagined a social order founded on reason. She was wildly criticised and penalised for these crazy, crazy thoughts. Over the last century, we've seen huge steps for women around the world in terms of being able to vote, having access to education, and having legislation for equal rights and pay in the workforce. Here in Australia, women, with the shameful exception of Aboriginal women in some states, got the vote in 1902. But it wasn't until 1942 that we saw Dame Enid Lyons and Senator Dorothy Tangney become the first women elected to the federal parliament. Then in the late 60s, we saw a shift in allowing married women to carry on working and legislation to mandate for equal pay between men and women. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote about equal rights for women in the 1790s. Australia's commitment to equal rights for women came in 1984 with the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act. These are significant steps for women. In Australia, women make up just over half the population, not surprisingly. More women than men are educated at secondary schools and universities, and more women than men graduate from university with bachelor degrees. About 4.8 million women were in some form of paid employment in 2008, and there was a labour force participation rate for women of about 58%. More than 30% of Australia's small business operators are women. Women make up more than half of the Australian public service workforce, 57%. And they hold 36% of senior executive positions in government. Women hold 34% of all seats on federal government-controlled boards, and around 23% of the chair or deputy chair positions on these boards. In federal parliament this year, 28.3% of members and senators are women. In the Senate, there are 27 women out of a total of 76 senators. And in the House of Representatives, there are 37 women out of a total of 150. We're starting to go down here, aren't we, on these numbers? Let's look at the private sector. This is where I get my soapbox out. Despite high flyers like Westpac's Gail Kelly and Australia's richest woman, Gina Rinehart, women hold only 12% of management jobs in private companies in Australia, private and listed companies, and they only hold 9% of private board directorships. I recently watched the movie Made in Dagenham. I don't know if any of you have seen it. You need to see it, it's a good movie. It's the story of the female machinists at the Ford factory in Dagenham in London. In the 60s, they went on strike protesting that they were being paid less than men. And their action fanned out across the UK and led ultimately to the introduction of the Equal Pay Act in 1970 in the UK. I got to the end of the movie and it talked about the introduction of the legislation, and it was, a nice full stop to the end of the movie. And I huffed and I puffed and I said, well, we still don't have equal pay. And my husband turned to me with a look of surprise, but we do, don't we? What are you talking about? Unfortunately, the fact is that a century after people were marching in Europe demanding equal pay for men and women still earn about 80% of their male counterparts for doing the same job. Powerful businesswomen don't escape this. It gets worse the more senior you are and the higher up your business status. In 2008, the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Agency, EOWA, found that if you look at CEOs and CFOs, the gaps were almost 50% between men and women doing the same job in some instances. There's no question that the gender gap is alive and well, particularly in our top public companies. Finance and insurance industry, this is an area that I work in almost exclusively. The average pay gap, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is 30%. Now, this is a figure that's normalised for men and women doing the full-time equivalent, same role. Often in the corporate and business world, your pay says something about where you sit in the hierarchy. As a general rule, we feel that people who are paid more matter more. Businesses have been able to get away with this because there's no transparency around pay packets, and there's a culture of not telling people what you earn. We all know that women still experience inequities in work and life. Compared to male counterparts, women on average have lower workforce participation rates, earn less, they're more likely to retire on significantly lower incomes, and they're also more likely to occupy precarious positions in the labour market in part-time and casual roles, work that's lower paid and less secure, and less likely to provide opportunities for training and development. Of course, much of this inequity continues to stem from the primary responsibility of women for caring for their families, and the impact that subsequent breaks from the workforce over the life course can have on their economic status and well-being. But let's widen our thoughts to a global scale. I've talked about Australia here. Discrimination and oppression is still a daily reality for women in the world. The stats are 70% of the world's poor are women. Women own 2% of the world's wealth. 1 in 5 members of parliament are women. Every minute a woman dies as a result of a complication associated with pregnancy and childbirth. Every minute. 1 in 3 women will experience some form of violence against them in our lifetimes. So how many women in this room will that affect? All of these alarming statistics come back to the fact that women are still not equal here in Australia or around the world, and gender stereotypes continue to dominate. The Millennium Development Goals are an important step towards ensuring equality for women. For those that haven't heard of them before, there are 8 Millennium Development Goals, and there are a set of targets for 2015. They range from halving extreme poverty, halting the spread of AIDS, providing greater primary education. And they form a blueprint that have been agreed to by all countries around the world. There have been considerable gains since 2000, which is when they were introduced, on many of the targets. But the progress has been the slowest on the gender equality one. And this covers things like improving maternal health, having access to a decent work and eradicating hunger. Goal 3 is the one I'm talking about. Promoting gender equality and empowering women. It's got to focus on education, waged employment, getting more women into politics. Why? Why that focus? Well, the potential of women's impact on the global economy is being increasingly realised. To date, many of the women around the world haven't been prepared or enabled to contribute in terms of their education and the supporting infrastructure around them. But that's changing. We've got increased migration, we've got expanded education opportunities, and we've got emerging economies. If China and India represent 1 billion emerging people in the global marketplace, then there's a third billion that we need to consider. And this is made up of women in both developed and industrialised nations, developing and industrialised nations. These are the women who have been underutilised, suppressed, stunted in their contribution to the economy. They're women who have been living at a subsistence level who are now entering the mainstream economy for the first time. Booz & Co. have just recently done a study, and they've estimated that there's 870 million women who are going to come into the economy. And that number could go past 1 billion over the next decade after that. Emerging economies account for 95% of those women, and developed economies account for 5%. What I find interesting is that it's easy to see the problems that we've talked about when you look at developing countries. It's much easier to point the finger and say, oh yes, you can see it over there. But the same issues that women face in these developing countries are often faced by women here in Australia and in other developed countries, but just to a different extent. So look at pay equality. On a global scale, in developed countries, women earn an average of 77% of what men earn. In developing countries, they earn 73%. So it brings me back to my earlier discussion on the status of women in business here in Australia. There's no question that we have a gender gap here in the country, and many people don't see it, so I want to give you some stats. The World Economic Forum ranks countries around the world on opportunities for men and women, and they look at a number of areas like economic participation, political participation, health. And they rank Australia jointly as number 1 in the world for the education of its women. So there's 22 countries around the world who are ranked number 1. And this is about the investment of the countries in the education of women. So Australia's ranked number 1. New Zealand's also ranked number 1. But in the overall ranking, so when you take the big umbrella picture, Australia's dropped 3 places, and we're 23rd overall. So we're first on education, but we're 23rd overall. And we rank overall behind Mozambique, Sri Lanka, and Lesotho. And this is a downward trend. Okay, we were 15th globally in 2006, and we're now 23rd. And I want to put that in some context. New Zealand has ranked 5th consistently since 2007, and it rose from a ranking of 7th. So we're going down drastically, and they're going up and they're staying there. When you look at how this ranking is broken down, look at economic participation and opportunity. Australia's ranked 24th, and these are the countries that we're ranked behind for economic participation. So this is looking at pay equality, opportunity to work and contribute to the economy. We're ranked behind Mongolia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Gambia, the Philippines, and Lithuania. Now, New Zealand is ranked 9th. We're ranked 24th. There's something going on here. Look at political empowerment. We rank 39th, and we rank behind Bangladesh, Angola, Namibia, Mozambique, Cuba, and Nicaragua. New Zealand's 8th. Okay? This gap between investing in women's education in this country and not supporting them in the economy to contribute is huge. It doesn't make business sense as a country. And it affects Australia's global competitiveness. So Goldman Sachs did a report last year, and they had a look at this gap, and they said, well, if Australia could fix the gap, then Australia's GDP could go up by 11%. That's how we're affecting our country's competitiveness and productivity. There's a strong connection between how women are treated in the corporate world and how they're treated in other areas of life and society. And that's why, for myself, I want to really focus on creating more opportunities for women in the big business sector, because it has such a wide ripple effect for our society. Career choices for women used to be so limited, but we've still got a problem. Women are not making it to the top of any profession anywhere in the world in any numbers. And the numbers, small, that we have at the moment are not moving. Women are just dropping out of big business. We've got, at the moment, women hold 8% of executive key management positions in our top 200 listed companies in Australia, 4% of CEO roles. Now, a lot of people argue that this is a pipeline problem, that we get them in at the bottom and eventually it will all come through. But 22 years ago, women made up 32% of the cohort getting professional qualifications. 32%. And at the same time, we had anti-discrimination legislation and equal opportunity legislation coming in. So why are there still so few women at the top? It's not a pipeline problem. The fact is, we're a long way from achieving gender equality here in Australia and around the world. And a persistent lack of women in leadership roles remains and is a huge factor in this. When we consider this loss of productivity, superannuation and savings, as well as the broader impact on the GDP for the country, failing to lift the level of females working in business and politics is going to continue to contribute to the economic problem for Australia. Does it really matter? Power and leadership. Do women really want them? This is often talked about. Yes. The answer has to be a resounding yes. Women want to influence the way we live, and we want to influence the lives of others around us. And without access to power, we risk losing many of the gains that we've made over the last century. If we want to continue to achieve change here in Australia and globally, women need to be ready to make and take the opportunities. And we need to support other women to gain leadership roles and keep them. So we've looked at some powerful women, and we've looked at the changes happening for women here in Australia and globally. And we've heard a lot about the problems of pay inequality and not making the most of women's education in the economy. This conversation is gathering speed here in Australia, and I'm pleased to see a room full of people here, because I think there's a real interest and discussion and conversation happening. And Australia is rapidly becoming a trailblazer in this conversation around the world. And, I live and breathe this, and I am quickly seeing that we are at least 3 or 4 years ahead in our thinking from Europe, the US. People are starting to come here to see what we're doing. The words best practice, which I hate, are starting to get used about what's happening here in Australia. But we're challenging the status quo, and when you challenge status quo, the law of physics, you're always going to get resistance to challenging inertia. We have to remind ourselves, again, a nice pop culture reference, but for those that have seen Mad Men, it's a great TV series. If you haven't seen it, again, you've got to go and see it. But it reminds us how far we've come culturally over the last 50 years, doesn't it? Women don't have to leave work when they get married, just the way that, all sitting around with their jugs of vodka on the boardroom table and smoking cigars and whatever else they're doing. But, we need to look back at some of those things that we laugh about when we see Mad Men and say, well, what's changed? Now, we've got legislation to stop us smoking inside buildings. Would we all have stopped smoking inside restaurants and bars and buildings if we didn't have legislation, if it hadn't become illegal? It wouldn't. Would we all wear our seatbelts if it hadn't become legal, if there wasn't legislation to force us to change? We need to think about that. I think we're at a stage here in Australia where we need to legislate to make that transition on these important gender equality things. So let's go back to my question. Are women taking over the world? I think you know where I'm heading with this one. The answer has to be a resounding no. There's a better question. Do we want to take over the world? And again, the answer has to be a resounding no. What we want is balance and inclusion for both sexes. Including 50% of the population doesn't seem very scary or radical. It comes back to Mary Wollstonecraft, her crazy thoughts about we're all equal, and let's all have access to education. But we're so far away still from achieving this. Now, Madeleine Albright was speaking at the TED Women Conference in Washington in December, and she pointed out, it's not about women taking over. And if you think that, you've obviously never been to an all-girls high school. Thank you.